Hey everybody, it's Kevin from 3D Printed Props, and today I'm going to show you how I printed, painted, and assembled this incredible statue from Wicked 3D. This thing is awesome. Okay, so if you've watched any of the videos on my channel, you know that I'm a huge comic book collector, and this Thanos statue from Wicked 3D, his information is below his Patreon. Incredible files. This is like the old school comic book version, and that's what I grew up with. Thanos Quest, the whole Infinity Gems, reading those issues when they first came out, getting them right off the shelf. This is what Thanos looks like to me, and I just loved the pose of this thing, and as you can see, it is huge. Now, I talk about this in another video I did where I reviewed the Saturn II, but if you haven't seen that, it'll pop up one of these corners. Go ahead and watch that. This was printed there on my Saturn II. All of it except for this cape right here and this long cape right here. Can't wait to show you how I painted it, some of the problems I had, how I overcame those problems, and this is probably one of my favorite statues. Let's go ahead behind the fake wall and I'll show you how I did it. Okay, so these are probably the most amount of prints I've ever had to sand resin-wise. Now, make sure you wear a respirator. Now, you can see how sometimes, you get some bloops there coming out after you've made your holes, some resin hardening up. So I'm going to start with a 220, and then I'm going to go to a 320, then a 400, till everything's smoothed off where they connect. You can see here the bumps from the supports. I try to make sure the supports are in areas you're not going to see, so if I don't have to sand them too much to make them look good. And you can see here, you can still see the bumps, so we're going to keep going until we take it down until it goes all white. And then I'm test fitting every once in a while to see if there's some places that need to get something taken off. Like here, I'm using a file. If you're interested in any of the parts I use, just look in the, or things I use, just look in the description below. Sometimes you do have to take a little bit off of the pegs, and then it fits nice and tight. I find that, sometimes it gets a little bloop at the end, and you gotta clear that off. Same thing here. So those aren't really sitting flush. So I'm just going to snap these off. You're not going to see them. They just got a little bit too big, or there's some resin at the end of it. Snap them off. Now I set this little thing up. Good thing I got this monitor in, and I used some dowel, and I put all these in my driveway. And I'm going to use this fine surface primer because of all the detail in this resin, and then just paint all of these parts. And it took quite a while. Now that they're all primed, and I used the 2-in-1 primer, again, everything in the description below, and I used a 2-part epoxy to put these together because there's a lot of weight in this statue, especially with Lady Death. And don't forget, if you're having problem getting things to stay together like this, especially with epoxy, use clamps. Don't go too hard, you don't want to crack it, but use some clamps, and that way that stuff isn't going anywhere. Now here's something I noticed in the model. Death stands on this, this plateau, just that foot area. So what I did was I thought I'm going to drill a hole through her and put a dowel in there and then feed that dowel through the skulls. Yeah, I cracked that. I had to fix it later. Again, I'm using epoxy here because, again, this holds a lot of weight. The death statue with those cloaks and all her garments, they weigh quite a bit. Even though I printed these, obviously not solid, they still have some weight to them. And again, another clamp to hold that into place. So this is where I made a little mistake. I made sure I checked things before I started really letting things dry, but this is all dry, and I really had to push that skull into place and was very worried it was not going to go in there. Now I've got a little glue behind it, just some Bob's super glue, because that's not really holding anything up. And again, I use a clamp to try to minimize the gap, but there is quite a gap, and that happens just because when you're printing with your resin printer, sometimes there's just a little bit of a movement there. I'm going to use epoxy sculpt and these tools here for clay to just squeeze this epoxy sculpt in and form it. Now, epoxy sculpt is great because it, turns into epoxy. It hardens right up, and you can sand it. But I noticed it looked a little too just perfect looking because I'm smoothing it with these tools and I'm getting it to go into those spaces. So I realized I really needed to mess it up a bit. So I got this really hard bristled brush and I'm just jabbing it with it while it's still, soft, and making sure I smooth out areas and contour areas to the actual model to make sure it blends in as well as possible. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but we also have to remember it is in the back. We are going to paint it and we're going to weather it. So you're going to be surprised at how fast and how great it just disappears when we finish this model. Now, I work on the cape a little bit more here because it's more of a, organic shape and it's really in the front. So use some more epoxy to put this together because even though, again, it's hollow, it's thin enough where it's kind of solid. Now we're going to go ahead and do the gold, so we need to do some taping. And I like this Tamiya tape and this vinyl tape because the vinyl tape you can really sort of bend around things, and then just standard blue painter's tape for the bigger areas. So this is that Tamiya tape, and I'm just going over and doing the fine areas first. And here's that vinyl tape. You could see I was able to use one piece of tape and just bend it right around because it's vinyl. Then we put some regular blue tape on there to cover it all up. And yeah, this was a fun one. A lot of fun. No, it wasn't. So here we go. Look at this. This is the epoxy job. Very hard to see where that line is. And again, we're not even done weathering this. This is just the gray base coat because I figured why do all this with acrylics? It's going to be a gray tone. I know I wanted that. So I started there. And you can see here, you have a real hard time finding out, noticing where that was. Now for the fun part, I wish it was fast as this, but that is taking all the tape off, and look at that gold. It looks awesome. And now we're going to go with the blues. So I make two of these basics together. Again, everything that I use is in the description below. And I'm going to paint all of these blue pieces, this nice blue shade that I matched with some references that I found online for Thanos' old school uniform. And some of it wasn't as easy as just the legs and the arms that are all one color. I had to break out the smaller brushes to get into these little cracks and crevices. And unfortunately, one coat wasn't enough, so I had to let it dry and then go back for a second one. While I was waiting, I went ahead and worked on the helmet. Again, fine detail, very fiddly, but if you use the right brush and put a little bit of water in your paint so it doesn't get too gloopy, then you can get in there just nice. You can see there needs another coat. Now, I'm going to break out and do these infinity gems. So I was wondering, how am I going to do this? I went ahead and painted the gems gold, and then I used these Vallejo inks, so they're translucent. And the gold shows through, and you can see here, they really look like gems. It's not standard paint. It is just it's an ink, so you can see through it. So I test fit the foot to make sure everything's okay. It is. Very happy about that. And I'm going to go ahead and start weathering. And you can see here, we do weathering like always. We get a big fat brush, a little black acrylic, some water, soup it in there, and then wipe it away in the high areas and letting it stay in the deeper areas. And you can see here in a little bit of closer view, I'm literally just painting this thing black. So it's doing a couple things. It's going to stay in those cracks and crevices, and it's actually going to darken those skulls up a little bit because I really think they needed it anyway, and I was quite happy with it. We're going to go ahead and dry brush them anyway, so it's okay. Now here's where people are probably freaking out if they've never seen weathering before. You just made this gold gauntlet look nice and shiny, but look at the model. He is in a battle. His clothes are torn. There is destruction all around him. He is dirty. So this is just some acrylic paint and some water, and we're working it all in there. And then we're going to wipe it away with a paper towel, and you can see how it keeps it in the low-lying areas. The areas where dirt would accumulate, that's where you want it to stay. You don't want to wipe it totally off. I might wipe too much off, so when you do that, because I tend to do that too, you just go back in there and add a little bit more and then wipe a little bit less away. But you can see how this is, turning this into just this sort of static model, this boring sort of paint job, to something that has a little bit of life in it because it's telling that story. Again, I got it a little too clean, so I'm going to go back and actually add some more later. And I'm going to do this to all the gold pieces, just wiping some stuff away. Again, you don't want to wipe it all away, and you want to keep it in the cracks and stuff. Now, I did realize I didn't weather this big skull. So it's the biggest one there. I don't know how I could have missed it. But I went ahead and souped this thing up, and that was a lot of fun just watching the black sort of ooze all over it. And again, I'm just going to go at it with a paper towel, wrinkle it up so when you're dabbing, you're keeping those organic, natural shapes. Don't take it all off. Again, if you do, no big deal. Just go ahead and add some more. And then I realized it's a little too gray, a little too black. So I use this Vallejo wash, this mud color. You could just mix up brown acrylic paint and water. I just bought this stuff because I really wanted to try it. I love the texture of it. And I'm just going to hit certain areas on the model and then wipe it away a little bit, just so it's not just all black. I get some browns in there. And again, it looks a little bit more natural. Again, you're trying to tell a story. Now for the real fun part here. I'm going to be dry brushing all the blue pieces. And what dry brushing is you just get a little bit of paint on the brush, and then you wipe most of it off on a paper towel or on your hand, and you just lightly brush over the high parts. And you can see as I brush over them, they are staying light, especially in this ribbing here. They get this bright seam, but everything below it stays the darker tone, stays the actual tone. And you can see how it picks up that detail. But I did want to go ahead and add some of this dark wash. This is like a purple or a blue wash through the cracks here because I really wanted them to retain that blue color, but also have a darker tint to him because, again, he's in battle, and I think it really needed that. And you can see with the detail in this model, when you're doing this dry brushing, there's actually a little bit too much paint on this. I should have knocked some off, but it was working, so I kept it. You can see how it's making all the structures of the muscle just really pop. And again, it's not getting into those cracks, so the darker blue is still there. So you're building up this depth. I'm going to probably go through and add a little bit of shading into the darker areas using that dark wash later, but I'm pretty happy with it right now. If I had to do it over again, I probably would have used a little bit darker blue. But in the end, I do a few things that you'll see that really help pull everything off. Then we're going to go ahead and work on some of his face, and I can only do so much of this on camera because I really got to get in there, and if I'm in there that close, you can't see it. Now for Death, I'm just going to go straight black. And now we're going to go ahead and start doing the dry brushing technique. Same thing, hardly any paint on there. It's like a whitish gray, and I'm just hitting the high points of these skulls. And yeah, I'm going to do all of them. Some more detail than others, the ones that are bigger, like this one. You can see here just a little bit of paint on there, and I'm just brushing it over and hitting those highlights. And since this model is so textured, it's picking up so much detail, it's crazy. Now, again, I was looking a little too much gray color in there. This stuff looked like machinery, so I went ahead and just used a brassy color, and that's one of the Vallejo metallics. But he looked too clean, and I love doing this. I've done this in a few projects, the Dune sword and the bull statue. I'm using that wash, and I'm using a brush, a hard bristle brush, and I'm just stippling it, and it just really gives it this level of detail and realism of mud and grime that really, really sell the piece. And I'm going to be doing this on everything that definitely needs it. Again, I'm going to be using the 2-part epoxy because this holds a lot of weight. The Thanos statue is hollow, but still, it's pretty big. And I wanted to make sure that it wasn't going anywhere. So for all of these parts, here in the bottom, I've got this epoxy, and I'm trying not to touch the model with my epoxy hands, and I do every once in a while, and I wipe it off. So I'm going to set that in there, and I went ahead and did the waist too, because once this locks into place, everything else is fine. It can move around. Now I can move it, and I can make sure it's sitting properly. I didn't want to put the legs in and then all of a sudden go to put the waist on later, and I had it off a bit. Now I noticed there were some gaps in there, and I was a little worried, so I used the syringe with some super glue, the Bob's medium super glue, and it just went in all those cracks and ran down a little bit, but that's okay. Now we're going to do some dry brushing again, and again, you're just skating over the high areas lightly to really sell the depth of the piece. Once you do it with a lighter tone, then you go over it again after it dries with an even lighter tone to give it that detail. Now here's it fully painted. Again, I can't do this at the camera because I have to get in really close, but his eyes are nice and black and everything's looking pretty cool. Now for this stuff, I'm just using the Bob Super Glue. I love this stuff because this isn't, the weight-bearing stuff on the legs, the feet, and the waist. And I'm just putting everything on in place. I'm sorry that it's a little out of focus. I think the camera is focusing on that Jason mask because it thinks it's a face, but I realized it was doing it and I fixed it. So the arms, I'm just using some accelerator. This stuff accelerates the curing process of the super glue because those arms just would have fallen right off and I didn't feel like holding them. Same thing for the gloves. I give each one of these a little bit of a sprit to go on. Funny thing is, that glove I accidentally printed solid and it weighs more than the whole chest area. And there we go. Now we're going to pop his head on. And I am so happy with this fit. It is almost, it's hard to even notice that that thing is there. Now we're going to put some other pieces of the model on, like this guy here. It's just this front emblem. And we're going to start on death. Now here's where I made a mistake. Why I didn't glue this earlier and use epoxy to get rid of this line, I don't know. So I don't show it, but what I end up doing is I glue it together, I get some epoxy sculpt out, and I fill in the crack around the dress. And there you can see, I got to give it another coat. You don't see this big seam because it was not good. So again, more dry brushing. This is sort of like a grayish blue color I mixed up. It's just white paint, black paint, and a little blue paint. And again, this model, it does have to work for me. There's so much detail in it. When I'm skating this brush, you can see there's almost no paint on the brush. I'm bearing down on it. And it's just picking up all of this detail. And this is all I'm going to do for this because I want this part to be pretty simple, pretty easy. I don't want it to, stand out too much to take away from Thanos, but I definitely want to pick up all that kind of cool detail that's in there. And I think the blue sort of helps mimic his blue a little bit. And the brush is so dry that when it scrapes across one of the flatter areas, as you can see here when the head's on here, it almost looks like spider webs. So really happy. Now here's this thing I'm doing. I'm drilling a hole through this because I'm going to fit this dowel through because I don't think this thing can hold up just on that little tiny peg in her foot. So I pour some epoxy in. I ram this dowel through. It doesn't show up, but it was way too big the first time, so I cut it down in half. I slathered that dowel with epoxy, and then I put some more epoxy sculpt around the opening of it. Again, I didn't show that. Now here was the key thing I realized. Wait a second, is this straight? Is this where it's supposed to be? So I went ahead and looked at it from all the way around, and I taped it to make sure that it was going to be in the right position. Then I realized it's actually tilting a little bit, but I figured I'll fix it later. I haven't put the epoxy on yet. I put on this back piece, and I'll tell you what, this Wicked 3D, he does such an amazing job with making his files fit together. Yeah, sometimes there's a little bit of tweaking you got to do, but man, that thing snapped in, and I almost didn't even have to epoxy that. And you can see here I sort of jimmied this so it would actually be straight. And there it is. So happy with how this thing turned out. The detail in the model, and just I had a great time painting it and making it really, really just something out of my childhood. I was so excited to see this model, and I love all the detail. It's on my desk now in a place of honor because it's probably my favorite statue that I've done. I just love this thing. So now I just measured this. I thought it'd be good for the video. It is 24 inches high. It's the largest statue I've done. It's probably the largest I want to go just because I don't even know where I'm going to put this one, let alone something bigger. So this is the perfect size and I totally love it. The different techniques I got to make it look aged and weathered and worn. Super fun to do. I love doing these kind of things. If you want to see more large figure painting and finger painting, large figures painted and constructed on the channel, let me know in the description below. If you're also interested in any of the paints or the things that I used to make this look the way it looks, you can find those below. You can also find a link to my Patreon page. I also have one, and you get 4 files a month for $12. And there is a commercial licensed one there, 25 bucks for 4 files. It allows you to, print out the models and sell them, but not the files, of course. So guys, thanks a lot for listening. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great day.